Hello, and welcome to The Music That Shaped Us. The Ragged Blade Band presents a history of African American musicians. My name is Courtney, and on behalf of Case Cardinia Libraries, I am proud to be hosting Jerry and Cherry all the way from St. Louis, Missouri. Today, Jerry and Cherry will be taking us on a historical tour of some of the great African American musicians who have shaped the music of today. So sit back and enjoy as you are taken back to a time of early jazz, blues, and ragtime, a truly magical journey. Enjoy.
Good afternoon. I am Jerry Rabushka.
I'm Isaac Cherry.
And we are Cherry and Jerry. And we want to welcome you to our show of early African American composers.
That's right. African American composers and musicians are responsible for almost every invention and every innovation that came along in American popular music, from ragtime, blues, jazz, even rock and roll. In this program, we want to explore some of the greatest songwriters from over 100 years ago, even some of the lesser-known composers who made some enduring contributions to American popular music.
First, though, we do want to thank Courtney and the Casey Cardinia Library for having us here today. We are in St. Louis, Missouri in the USA, and we're excited to be broadcasting to you there in Australia. It's kind of an exciting thing for us, so we thank you also for being here with us. So our first composer did not actually invent a style of music like some of these people were instrumental in doing it, but he became one of the most famous personalities as a black minstrel songwriter. And tell us a little about James Bland.
That's right. James Bland was from Flushing, New York. He was born to a free African-American family in 1855. His family was unusual for most black families during the time because his family was a very well-to-do black family. His father was one of the first African-American men to ever go to college, and shortly after the Civil War, he moved his family to Washington, D.C., where he accepted a job as the first black U.S. patent examiner. James Bland eventually went to Howard University, which is a historic black university here in the United States. This school is where he found his love of music, theater, and a love of banjo. However, Howard University had a strict educational environment, and they didn't really allow much theater and music and banjo playing. So he did what any other kid would have did that was in college during that time. He snuck out to see some of the shows and eventually quit school and started a career in music. At that time, he did what most musicians were doing at that time, black or white. The most popular type of entertainment was the minstrel show. So he ended up going into a minstrel troupe, singing and performing, and eventually writing some of his own songs. The troupe performed his song called Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, which was published and became an instant hit. His next couple of songs were also well received, and before long he began to be compared with the great Stephen Foster, who was a famous composer from a generation before.
So I'm going to play a tune called In the Evening by the Moonlight that James Bland wrote around 1880 when he was, I think, 24. And this is a solo piano number, so Cherry will be back for the next song. But this song was recorded quite a bit, even into the 20s and the 30s, and it made quite a reputation for him. This is In the Evening by the Moonlight. In the Evening by the Moonlight by James Bland. And he had an interesting life after that. He went with a minstrel troupe over to England in about 1882. And when they came back to America, he stayed in London and actually lived there for about 20 years. And he'd go back and forth, but pretty much he lived in Europe. He toured, he did a command performance for Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. And he would go, he went to Germany, France, all those places, and he played solo in the big concert halls with him and his banjo. He made a lot of money. He wore some nice clothes, some nice jewels, and he spent a lot of money. And the one thing he didn't do, if you notice that song doesn't syncopate, it's very boom, 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 boom. Music changed, and he didn't. And when he came back to America, he was kind of behind the times, and he could never kind of come back as vaudeville and ragtime took over. And he died in 1911, and he was poor and sick, but he did leave us a legacy. The song Carry Me Back to Old Virginia was actually one of the top 3 recordings of 1915. It was recorded by a Jewish Romanian immigrant named Alma Gluck, and she sold over 1 million copies and became the 7th gold disc that was ever awarded. And Ray Charles, who is a famous singer, you've probably heard of him also, he recorded Georgia on My Mind, and Carry Me Back to Old Virginia was the B-side of his single in 1960. Now here is a recording of another tune by Bland. This is called Oh, Them Golden Slippers from about 1927.
Golden slippers must be nice and clean, and your age must be just sweet 16. Your white kid gloves you will have to wear when you ride in the chair in the morning. Oh, them a golden slippers, oh, them a golden slippers, them a golden slippers I'd gwine to wear, cave the looks on me. Oh, them a golden slippers, oh, them a golden slippers, them a golden slippers I'd gwine to wear to walk the golden street.
All right, our next composer, his name is Ernest Hogan. Ernest Hogan was born in 1865 in Bowling Green, Kentucky, with the name Reuben Ernest Crowders. At a very young age, he wound up in Topeka, Kansas, and spent a lot of time in between there and Kansas City. He worked as a shoe shineman and a paper boy, and developed a love in music and self-taught himself piano. Some of his early experiences were on stage as children in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and from there, he moved into traveling in the minstrel and vaudeville shows, and gained notoriety as a solo artist. Somewhere along the line, he took on the name Hogan. Some argue it's because of the Irish comedians that were in vogue at the time. He spent a lot of time touring, and in 1895, he wrote a song based on the dance he was doing called La Palma La, or La Pasma La. Hogan became known as the father of the ragtime, not, he said, because he's the first to invent it, but he's the first to notate it and get it out into the public.
Actually, Ernest Hogan was first in a lot of things. He was the star of the first all-black show on Broadway. It was a musical review called Clorinda, or The Origin of the Cakewalk. And he sang some of the popular numbers. He did some choreography for that. He was one of the first black celebrities, or possibly the first, to move into Harlem when Harlem was being marketed as an upscale neighborhood for African Americans. And he was making $300 a week doing his vaudeville circuit when most vaudeville performers would make $15. He also became the first African American to both produce and star in a Broadway show. This was called The Oyster Man, which he put on in 1907. And he was suffering from tuberculosis at the same time, and the show didn't run long because he actually collapsed during a performance and passed away a couple years later. But we are going to play a tune called I Can't Keep My Eyes Off of You, which he co-wrote as part of The Oyster Man. It seems to be a popular song of his even to this day. 1, 2, 3, 4. Can't Keep My Eyes Off of You. It was by Ernest Hogan and another man named Will Votery. There is an Australia connection with Ernest Hogan. He, in 1899, he was the star of a troupe of black performers that they set sail from Vancouver, British Columbia, all the way to Australia in 1899 to do one of their shows, which was kind of a minstrel show type thing. And they went to Sydney, and they discovered that there was another black troupe that had gotten there 2-3 weeks before and had eaten up all their audience. So nobody was coming to see their shows. They went broke. And in fact, the producer of his show just took all the money they had. He left. They're stuck there in Sydney, don't know how to get out. So actually, the rival troupe in the American consulate raised some money, and they sent Ernest Hogan and his players to New Zealand. And they toured there for about 6 months. And they kind of were like, we should have gone to Melbourne because nobody was doing this there. But they went back to Sydney after that, and they decided they were going to do different types of shows. So they did more classical, some Christmas music, some sacred songs. And that way they weren't competing. And don't forget, in these days, if you would take a trip like this, you would be in a place for a long time because you had to take a boat, you had to sit there for a while. So in the end, they did manage to get some success. And
Interesting connection, cool.
That was kind of a cool thing, yeah. So Ernest Hogan actually did some co-writing with our next composer.
That's right, he did. Chris Smith. They wrote some really cool tunes together. Chris Smith was born in Charleston, South Carolina. He was one of the biggest, one of the best songwriters from the ragtime era. He was the master of the ragtime song and show music. He was able to change with the times because blues and jazz, as we said earlier, was starting to come in vogue. He was able to make that transition. He stayed relevant from in the teens all the way through the 20s. He came from Charleston, South Carolina, and he was a baker's apprentice.
And how do you become from a baker's apprentice to a Broadway star?
Well, easy. He ended up selling baked goods to some of the actors that were hanging around the theater, and that ended up leading him to being an extra, making 50 cents a show. He eventually made his way to New York City with a friend and joined the vaudeville scene. And in 1898, they published their very first published song. This was a 1901 hit called "Carry Me Back to Old." I'm sorry.
Oops.
Good morning, Miss. Good morning, Carrie.
It was
and
another Carrie song.
It was another Carrie song. Good morning, Carrie. And his music eventually attracted some of the stars of the day, which led to more publications of the song and songs on stage. He was especially good at telling the joke song, where there's some sort of punchline in the end of the song.
So this is a very rare Chris Smith song. Chris Smith was one who was really famous in his time and is unfortunately largely forgotten today. And this is a song from 1905 he wrote called "Goodbye, I'll See You Some More." And the gist of it is the man's leaving his woman because she mistreats him. And at the end he says, "Goodbye, I'll see you some more." Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. some more by Chris Smith, 1905. Chris Smith is well known actually for being the composer of the hit tune Ballin' the Jack. And that song is still in the repertoire. It's been recorded over 150 times. It's been used in films. It's still pretty familiar today. And that's the song that's first you put your two knees close up tight, that kind of thing. And back in the almost through 1920, he was publishing 8, 10, 12 songs a year. And the thing with Chris Smith is when he didn't publish, nobody knows what he was doing. He would like fade totally out and he'd show up again. In the 1920s, he worked with a famous performer, Jimmy Durante. He's a well-known guy here in the States, at least. And he started writing lyrics more than music. And you actually hear from him all the way through the 30s and the 40s off and on. And he passed away in 1947 at the age of 69. Now, we're going to go to someone who's probably very familiar.
Yes, when you think of ragtime, most people think of the legendary Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin's one of the most famous personalities from this era, who was originally born in Texarkana in 1868. Both of his family, both of his mom and dad were both former slaves. His dad was a banjo player at plantation parties, and his mom was an avid singer. He eventually wound up in Sedalia, Missouri, where he got a formal education at the George R. College here in the States. It's where he got a more formal training in his music. Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, which is one of his most famous pieces, was named after the Maple Leaf Club in Sedalia, Missouri, and was published by John Stark. It became one of his biggest hits. It made ragtime a little bit more popular than it already was, and it also expanded on the harmonies and the rhythm of the genre. Stark moved back to St. Louis, followed by Joplin and several other top musicians from Sedalia. They all rented a flat in Delmar near Jefferson here in St. Louis. It's currently a state park here in St. Louis, and it's called the Scott Joplin House, and it's where The Entertainer was written in 1902. We're going to play for you The Entertainer.
Entertainer by Scott Joplin. And I was reading recently one of the reasons everybody came from Sedalia, Missouri, which is a smaller city still, to St. Louis was Sedalia cleaned up its act and they got rid of a lot of the gambling houses and just sort of places of ill repute where ragtime would flourish. So everybody was like, well, nothing's happening here. So they came here to St. Louis. So the Entertainer, in the 1970s, it was a huge thing. There was a fellow named Joshua Rifkin, and he made a ragtime album. And it was done in a very classical style. And he sold over 1 million copies of it and got some Grammy nominations. And also the movie The Sting came out, I think around 73. And The Entertainer was featured kind of as the theme song for that movie, which was Best Picture of the Year. And the score won an Academy Award here for Best Musical Score. So The Entertainer wound up number 3 on the Hot 100, about over 70 years after it was first published. And around here, at least when the ice cream truck comes down the street for the kids, that's what it does. So there were a lot of other folks who wrote ragtime, and we're going to talk about one of them now.
That's right. James Scott. James Scott's considered second when it comes to ragtime. It goes first. Number 1 is Scott Joplin. Number 2 is James Scott. He's considered the best ragtime composer other than Scott Joplin. He was born in Neosho, Missouri, which is southwest Missouri here in the States. He came from a musical family as well. His mother cleaned houses, and as his mother cleaned the houses, he would play the piano at the houses where his mother cleaned. He ended up moving to Carthage, Missouri, where he started demoing pianos for the Dumars Music Company. Sometimes he would even go over to the customer's house and demo the piano for an afternoon. He would play some of the hits of the day as well as some of his own compositions. The Dumars Company, in fact, created a publishing company and put out some of James Scott's first early rags. Eventually, Scott visited St. Louis in hopes of trying to advance his career. And this seems to be conflicting with other reports and historians, whether or not Scott Joplin and James Scott met one another. But what we do know is that Scott Joplin did put his music onto his publisher, John Stark, who ended up publishing more than 20 of James Scott's rags, all the way up until 1922. One of the more famous rags is called the Frog Legs Rag, which was one of the top-selling pieces in John Stark's catalog after the Maple Leaf Rag.
We always joke about John Stark, James Scott, and Scott Joplin and trying to get all those names straight. So we're going to do another piece that John Stark published. This is called Grace and Beauty, and as I like to say, we'll try to put a little of both into this. This is considered James Scott's finest rag, and this is from 1909. And one thing about ragtime is when you listen to it, you'll hear basically what it is. It's a European march in the bass and then syncopated African rhythms on the top, and that's kind of what gives it its special character. So again, Grace and Beauty by James Scott. Grace and Beauty by James Scott, 1909. And James Scott is known for being complicated and hard to play. And so we're always excited to bring you that music. He lived in Carthage, Missouri for quite some time. And if y'all have these little Precious Moments collection figurines over there, they're from Carthage, Missouri still. And when he was there, he formed a band of black musicians that did really well. And bands were, of course, segregated back in those times. And he also got started playing music for silent movies. He played piano and organ at the theaters. And he moved up to a city called Kansas City, which is across the state here from St. Louis. And he lived there till about 1938. And he played for silence until they started talking. He got started in jazz and did a lot of that as ragtime faded out until he passed away in the 30s. And speaking of jazz, our next song is a jazz hit, a very early jazz hit.
That's right. Our next song's written by Shelton Brooks. Many music historians consider 1918 the end of the ragtime era. As new forms of blues and new forms of music such as blues and jazz were starting to come in vogue, many composers of ragtime were starting to fade away. But there were several that were able to make the change. One of those was Shelton Brooks. He was born in Canada and he got his start in ragtime playing in the Detroit area. Eventually he moved to Chicago where he was known for being in vaudeville as a performer and singer, but also as someone who could score an occasional hit. In 1913, he wrote, "I Wonder Where My Easy Rider's Gone," which was sung by Mae West in the film where she says, "Why don't you come up and see me sometime?" The name of the film was called She Done Him Wrong.
That was from about 1933, actually. So Shelton Brooks cashed in just like Chris Smith would write Ball and the Jack. Shelton Brooks wrote Walkin' the Dog, was another one of those dance tunes that told you how to do the dance, and it became really popular. And that was 1916. And then in 1917, he really hit it big with this piece called The Strutter's Ball. And this is considered one of the first true jazz hits. This is Strutter's Ball by Shelton Brooks. Okay, so again, thank you for being with us.
Thank
That
you,
was
everybody.
Strutter's Ball by Shelton Brooks, and he sold about 3 million sheet music copies of that. And before we go on, I want to just mention that if you like us, you can follow us on Facebook at Cherry and Jerry Music. And we're also part of a larger band called the Ragged Blade Band, and we do these songs with the sax, guitars, some other vocalists. And you can find us at raggedblade.com and all kinds of social media. And
That's right. We're going to move now into the blues. Perry Bradford. Perry Bradford isn't well known these days, but his significance to music cannot be overstated. He is one of the first people to produce and record a solo African-American female artist on record. The impact of that is still felt even today, 100 years later, huh, Jerry?
it totally is, yes.
Bradford was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1895, but his family moved to Atlanta 6 years later. And fun fact that he grew up next door to a prison where his sister had to actually make some meals for the actual prisoners. However, he ended up picking up piano on his own, and one thing led to another. He found himself in show business and eventually left Atlanta for more opportunities elsewhere. He ended up picking up songwriting and ended up pairing and touring with a woman named Jamette Taylor, and they started to write blues songs for their act. As he got the idea to record some of these songs, he found that most record companies weren't interested in signing an African-American artist, especially a female, because they didn't feel like they could make any money off of them selling records. However, Bradford ended up focusing on this more and more, and Jamette Taylor lost interest and left the act. He replaced her with Mamie Smith and continued on in his push to get her on record. He finally convinced Okade Records. He finally convinced Okade Records executives there to take on Mamie Smith, and they ended up putting out this record called Crazy Blues in 1920. It was released, and it was a brand new sound, which made people go crazy. And it ended up selling over 75,000 records in its first month.
And that was at $1 a piece, and in 1920, that was a bit of an investment. Oh, so anyway, Crazy Blues by Perry Bradford. 1, 2, 3, 4. new sound at the time, and we have a little snip of this actual recording that Mamie Smith did back in 1920. So what happened when this thing really took off was the record company, OK Records, wanted more of this kind of music. A lot of people, Mae West and again Jimmy Durante, were getting a hold of Perry Bradford for songs. And everybody wanted to capitalize on kind of which was the black diva back in the day. And this helped launch the career of a lot of famous people such as Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and Ethel Waters, thanks to this one recording. Blues became a really big deal in the 20s, and it also marked a change to where instead of the sheet music becoming the important thing, the actual recording by the artist was sort of what people wanted, so that records became different. It wasn't to hear a song, it was to hear Mamie Smith do a song, and that was kind of a big change. And Bradford lived until 1970, and he published an autobiography later on in his life in '65. So we got a couple more tunes for you still.
That's right. The next composer we're talking about is W.C. Handy. He's considered the father of the blues, and the same as Ernest Hogan, not because he's the first to invent it, but the first to actually notate it and get it out in the public. He was born in Florence, Alabama in 1873, and W.C. Handy's first early gigs was playing in the minstrel band in his 20s. Accompanying the minstrel band, playing the cornet, I believe. In some of his reminiscences, he says that he realized that black music played in the minstrel band, which was mostly used music by white composers, wasn't anything like the music he heard musicians singing and playing back home where he came from. This is what led to him going out and seeking and notating blues, what we would know now as the blues, on his own.
That is true, and we're going to play a little snip of him recording the blues. It sounds a lot different than blues these days. This is Memphis Blues.
As blues took on its 12-bar phrase, Handy narrated that many New York publishers used to the 16-bar phrases wouldn't publish any of his music because they felt like 4 bars were missing. In Memphis, where he lived at the time, music publishers refused to publish him flat out because he was black. Eventually, this led to him creating his own music publishing company that he created in New York City.
And before we get to Handy, we're going to do a piece by another composer that he sort of championed. In 1926, Handy published the Blues Anthology, and this is considered sort of a groundbreaking work. He talks about how he came about being the father of the blues, and he features songs by him and other folks who published blues tunes up until 1926, and just a whole bunch of interesting information about how blues got started and how he did his field research. And this is a song from the anthology. This is called West Texas Blues by a guy named Charles Booker, who lived in Memphis. And what's interesting is instead of 12 bars, some of these phrases actually only have 11 bars. But Handy insists that we play it as written because it does give it kind of a little interesting kick to it. So this is from 1919. It's called West Texas Blues by Charles Booker. 1, 2, 3. That's not the right note. 1, 2, 3. West Texas Blues by Charles Booker. Yay! Again, we want to thank you for being with us. And we don't know a lot about Charles Booker. He did some recording and was active around the early to mid-20s. There are plenty of folks who have recorded this song, actually, mostly instrumentally. He wrote another tune called The Cootie Crawl, which again, like Ball and the Jack and Walking the Dog, tells you how to do the dance called The Cootie Crawl. And another song with the interesting title of A Woman Gets Tired of One Man All the Time.
Someone gets tired, he gets real tired, one man all the time. I mean, the same man all of the time. And when a woman gets tired, he gets real tired, one man all the time. Down the way that makes.
I love that song.
Yeah, we'll have to incorporate that into the band someday soon. But as you can see, too, that kind of looks forward into what blues became rather than kind of back into the teens and the O's. So Handy's most famous song, of course, is St. Louis Blues, but we're going to do another one we really like. This is, I think, the one he published after that. This is called The Yellow Dog Blues from about 1914.
Okay.
And So, Yellow Dog Blues, W.C. Handy, and we again thank Casey Cardinia Library for
Thank you.
having us here today, and
y'all
we
so much.
are really happy to be part of your Black History Month and share these awesome songs and stories with you.
Don't forget to support your local libraries.